Hello. My name is Zachary Friedman. I'm Director of Product at Immuta.
I'm Huey, Product Manager from Amazon S3.
And we are excited to talk to you today about simplifying data security in a complex data lake environment. So we are briefly going to talk about customer requirements and context for access controls in a hybrid data lake and data warehouse environment. Huey will talk about new feature for access controls on Amazon S3, and then we will briefly talk about our new Immuta Amazon S3 integration. So S3 fundamentally forms the storage backbone for all data, period. So no matter where the data is actually accessed, data is stored in S3. So for instance, if you're a Snowflake customer, that data is in S3. It is just abstracted away from you. If you use Databricks, the data is in S3 and an admin can access it. And obviously, if you use Redshift Spectrum, that data and its existence is known to the creator of an external table. So quickly, like one core question that starts to emerge, if you are responsible for maintaining one of these cross-platform, multi-engine analytical data platforms with a compute and storage aspect, is like, how should I think about doing this? Now, one approach is that when data is in S3, you could allow no raw data access directly from object storage. This allows you to control fine-grained access through like specific known access points, the query engines, like Spectrum, Snowflake, Databricks, and so on. The problem with this approach is that it is limiting. For one, it means that data scientists need to wait for data to land in a data platform before using the data. It means that open source tools can only be used if they support connecting to those data platforms. It also means that, for instance, like a straight file read without any sort of data transformation could incur unnecessary compute costs. And people can only access data in a data platform, like they have to have a login to that data platform. So quickly, in these large-scale analytical communities with, again, a storage and compute access pattern, it becomes challenging. Now, but there are plenty of reasons to limit direct S3 access too. Traditionally, managing complex and dynamic access control logic over S3 files has been challenging until now.
All right. Thanks, Zach. Hi, everyone. Huey from Amazon S3 product team. Just out of curiosity, how many of you guys like actually work in securities and data governance and at your companies? Okay, sweet. Okay, of course, Immuta folks. So this is a new feature we recently launched on Sunday, so 2 days ago, called Amazon S3 Access Grants. And what it does is a couple of things. First is allow you to grant S3 access directly to user and group in your external corporate directory. So today, S3, like most AWS services, mostly authenticate and authorize against IAM. So identity needs to be IAM principal, IAM user and roles. So this new feature is allowing you to grant access directly to directory user and groups. The second thing is we heard a lot of customers, they want to define access not using IAM policy, the brackety JSON, but in a more intuitive sort of grant style that's similar to how we define permission in a relational database. So with access grants, you can sort of define permission in a intuitive grant style. It's also highly scalable. Similar to the left side, first example, you grant different access level to directory users, directory groups. Last example, you grant different access to an IAM role. And what it does behind the scene is that access grants vends just-in-time, least privilege, short-term credentials, and when client need access, and that's based on sort of the grants, and it will do lookups and figure out the request authorized. If it is, it will authorize and then you as your credentials, and the client can then use to access S3. And last but not least, we heard a lot from customers that auditing is super important, especially if your companies are in financial services, government, healthcare, heavily regulated industries where you want to see end user access. So who accesses what data exactly at what time. So the feature come with integration with Cultural so that you can use Cultural to do that native and detailed audit history. And how does it work? So concrete scenario, you have your Azure bucket. Let's say PDF, MP4, JSON, a bunch of stuff like unstructured blob storage. And then you have your user that want access to the data. Traditionally, you will provision IAM principal for those users. Allow those users to assume those roles, and then you have bucket policy to manage access. In a world of access grants, and what you would do is that first you create what's called access grant instance, and this is sort of a per region, per account concept as a logical grouping for all your grants. Thereafter, you register all the grants, the permission saying who can have what level access to what, sort of what we talked about, intuitive grant style. And then when client, when they need access to S3, what they would do is that they call access grant instance and then get data access request saying like, hey, here's who I am, here's the S3 prefix, bucket, object, I would like to get access, can I get access? If the request is authorized based on all the grants that you registered, access grant will then you back S3 credentials, and these credentials are standard STS tokens, short-term credentials, and then the client can use that short-term credential to access S3. So in absence of us building this feature, we've seen a couple of large Azure customers building very similar construct, and this pattern, people call it credential broker, credential vendor, session token generator, and whatnot. So let's walk through a standard scenario where Azure Access Grant and Immuta might come into pictures of how it might help you. So let's say you work on data governance at your companies, and your data lake stack is fairly complex. It has Snowflake, Databricks, Starburst, and Redshift, of course. And you need to govern those data and make sure the right people have right access. And you need to enforce policy and register those policies. And you provision sort of role-based access. So you have finance and marketing. You have roles set up for them. You have permissions set up that govern those access. But increasingly, with the rise of Gen AI and machine learning, you have new persona like data scientists and machine learning engineer. What they need is that they need direct access to S3. Probably from a notebook environment. They pull data from S3, do some exploratory analysis, and then feed those S3 data directly to a machine learning model. But today, you manage those access mostly with IAM and bucket policy, which means that it's slightly sort of separate paradigm from how you would do it with Databricks and Snowflake in a more sort of traditional analytics and relational database like grant style. So what you want is be able to govern your S3 access the same as how you would govern your data access for Databricks, Snowflake, Redshift, and Starburst. And that's where Immuta can come in and help.
So building off of this S3 Access Grants feature, what Immuta has built is the ability, like Huey said, to grant S3 access alongside cloud-native data platforms in a common security model and policy engine. What Immuta adds to existing concepts of role-based access control is a concept called attribute-based access control. What this allows you to do is you can take attributes of identities, and so there's like an Immuta user that represents, it abstracts over the equivalent concept of an AWS IAM identity or like a human AD group or AD user identity. And that identity to Immuta can have attributes about it, like what department they're in, or it can get very fine-grained as well. And also taking attributes of data, so you create like an S3, the S3 prefix in the privilege grants you represent that as, we call this concept a data source in Immuta, and you can tag that S3 prefix or that abstraction over an S3 prefix as also having specific attributes. So for instance, like has PII. And you can use something like Amazon Macy to actually classify data inside of files and then use the results to build policy like in access logic. And then ultimately, to close it off, you get detailed audit access available via CloudTrail based off of features that S3 Access Grants has to integrate with CloudTrail for privacy requirements, and that will all eventually, in the short term, be like centralized into Immuta in a platform agnostic, like unified data model. And I just wanted to share a quote from a joint customer of ours that both Huey and I work with closely. So this is from a gentleman who's principal software engineer at Booking.com, who is like one of these folks who is responsible for building centralized access controls between Snowflake and S3. And so by leveraging both S3 Access Grants and the Amazon S3 integration from Immuta, they were able to build a single control plane for data owners and governors, so folks who are responsible for saying who is authorized to access what, to manage data access at scale, for like regardless if it's in S3, regardless of if it's structured or unstructured, in their data lake and in their cloud native data platform. And moreover, as the integration is based on new like native S3 access control capability, not only, so they said it gives them confidence that the controls will be enforced consistently. Also, like the fact that it's native access means like there's no agent, there's no proxy sitting in front of the data access to protect it. And so Immuta you can think of as a control plane orchestrator. You're able to write single data access policy in Immuta, and we push that out to S3 access grants. And then at data access time, you just ask, you call the get data access endpoint that Huey mentioned a few slides back, and that's just like an AWS to AWS call. There's nothing, there's no like Immuta sitting in front of it, of S3 there. And so, thank you everyone for coming to our talk. We do have time for questions if anybody has.